And this is where we start talking about trust, right? So when people sort of talk to me and I tell them I speak about trust, this is the kind of face that I get. I stole this from Google, by the way. Trust. Come on, like, really? Trust? That's such a warm, fuzzy feeling, right? Well, actually, today you'll see that there's way more to trust, that trust is about how we live every day, and this is something I want you to take away, how trust drives our decisions, how trust changes our behavior, and how it builds a better economy. Specifically, I'm going to start with Sadhguru. If you know Sadhguru, Sadhguru is an amazing guy. He says, desire is personal, vision is inclusive. So the reason why I talk about trust over monetary capital is because trust is by definition a form of social capital. And social capital means that we all benefit. In fact, that's something which I find fascinating, that by building value in the world, we build value in a more equal and a more inclusive fashion. This is the story of trust. And specifically, when we look at how this works, every single business is in the business of trust. And this means also that every single business faces, like ourselves, trust issues. The simplest trust issue is when something gets lost in translation. This causes a lot of problems, yeah? But there are far worse trust issues. And people ask me, like, is a trust futurist? What on earth is that? What are you trying to say here? And I'll tell you, it's really, really simple. I'm convinced that the future is actually super easy. It's basically the decisions that all of us and the 7+ billion people in the world make on a daily basis. Those decisions create the future, right? And in fact, some of those most profound decisions are the ones where we place our money and where we place our time and how we share our data. So when we look at how to change the way that we actually make these choices, we will create a better future. It's that simple. It's not rocket science. And now you may say, as your inner skeptic is starting to surface, trusting's nice, but knowing is better, right? Well, the reality is that we don't often have a choice of knowing. Most of the time, people can barely predict the weather, and it's much harder, in fact, to predict the economy even like a week ahead, let alone 10 years or 15. So we don't really have a choice but to trust. And I think that's a good thing, because really we rely on trusting more than knowing. Every day we assume that on a hygiene level, people are going to be kind to us, or at least are going to not harm us. And every day we assume the water we drink is safe. We assume that when we go to work, nothing's going to happen. So trust is kind of part of everyday life. And without that baseline trust, I reckon that, things are going to get quite difficult. But this means that, here's the thing, trust directs our behavior and directs how we achieve value. You may argue whether this is the best solution to your well-being, but certainly some people believe this brings them happiness. So be it. So trust is more about how we spend our time and money. And in fact, this is kind of what I like to say. Trust drives our behavior. Our behavior is kind of what then creates the choices we make in life. And the choices we make basically create the future. The future isn't rocket science. In fact, if you try predicting the long-term future, you get these hilariously off-mark predictions. But if you focus on the present and the near day-to-day decisions and our behavior, you can actually get a good glimpse of what's going to happen next. So when we look at this phenomenon of collective trust, what we believe in, collective trust is ultimately culture, is what we all believe is right. We find that it's one of the most important economic forces there are. And I mentioned the transactional trust earlier, right? That's like when you touch your card somewhere and you trust that that transaction is going to go through and you'll be fine. The second form of trust is really more contextual trust. This is where you basically talk about experts. So when you go to the doctor, you may trust the doctor for medical advice, right? But hopefully, probably not investment advice. So there's contextual trust. There are experts for certain things. And then there's this thing called universal trust, which means certain brands, people, and companies are universally trusted, which means that they can actually do all kinds of things. and you believe in the value they bring. And certain companies have most definitely achieved this. If you look at stock markets are driven by sentiment. And this is why I say, if we collectively change our sentiment, we will change the world we live in. It's actually that simple. So, the way I define trust is that trust is really about value, and it's the value that we realize in our socioeconomic interactions. So it's the value that we realize in our lives, pretty much. And the reason I define trust this way is because it does away with long 1, 2, 3 paragraph definitions of something we don't quite understand. And it's sort of the idea that we establish a baseline on trust that we can all agree with. So, really, when we talk about trust, we need to be aware of one major thing. That being trustworthy is nice. You know, we all talk about trustworthiness, doing the right thing, being ethical, all those wonderful things. Yet, that's useless economically when we're not trusted. Trust is a bit like the Force in Star Wars. You know, you can use it for good and for bad things. But the fact that it has value attached to it, that's the key component. So to me, I'd advocate, quite obviously, that we want to be both trustworthy and trusted. But being trustworthy alone is not enough. That's what I'm trying to say. So when we look at the world, we'll see that currently we're in this age of incredible business complexity. In fact, it's only going to increase. And the thing is, without trust, if we were to second-guess every step of the way in our day-to-day lives, we'd have a pretty hard time living our lives. Yet that's exactly what's happening in the business world. We have contracts, we have legal agreements, we have background checks, we have checks, and more checks. So we're actually wasting a lot of time on distrust. And because of that, we are, in fact, destroying or failing to realize value. And this is sometimes also economic value. So that means we are constrained by this inflationary distrust everywhere. Now, you'd be saying, okay, come on, Philipp, don't be ridiculous. We need that, right? As in, we can't sort of get away with all the sort of security checks and hope that the world will be fine, right? I agree with you. But this is also a story of how technology can help us overcome trust barriers, and how it can do so in a much more elegant and good experience that actually is more delightful for us and also creates more well-being in the process. So, this is the statistic. You know, whenever you need to convince somebody, you put up some statistic. But this statistic is from BCG, so you can trust those guys, okay? Yeah? In the 50s, we gained 5% incremental productivity every year. In the 80s, that was 3%. And, you know, I'm not a statistician, but this is a pattern right here. 2000, that number has gone down to less than 1%. Exponential productivity gains are not happening anymore. And yet at the same time, technology is exponentially evolving, right? It's getting ever more fast, in fact. So how come that technology gives us this hockey stick when productivity is sort of plateauing? What's happening in this world? What are we doing wrong? The answer is that this institutionalized notion of distrust is actually fueling stagnation around the world. And this is already a recognized economic phenomenon. So how do we solve it? Well, first of all, trust is starting to leave institutions. Again, whether we like it or not, it's happening. And it's moving in that process to interfaces and to the data and the technology powering those interfaces. If you've gotten into a car with a stranger, or slept in a stranger's house, or done any number of these really strange things through technology, you will know what I'm talking about. And the reason for this is that technology sort of allows us to scale trust and digitize trust, for better or for worse. What this means is that trust is becoming a lot easier. And it's also becoming a lot cheaper, because guess what? The reason financial institutions are some of the most profitable organizations in the world is why? Because they have a tax on trust, because they intermediate trust, and they make a huge amount of wealth through that. And a lot of the times, you know, financial institutions are the backbone of our countries, and that's good. But imagine what happens when technology brings down the cost of trust. What is that going to do to industries that rely on trust intermediation as their core business model? What do you think is going to happen? Well, we're seeing what's going to happen, because a lot of the time, fintech and other propositions have already shown this in the market. Now, This really means a couple things. First of all, it means that our behavior changes. And it means that technology, or specifically the trust economy using technology and data, is transforming who we trust as people, how we trust, and what we trust. To the point that people would actually be comfortable putting their investments with a fintech proposition that's barely been around for maybe 1 or 2 years. Why? Because the interface matters. Because a great interface can make people think that the product or the proposition is solid. And this means the entire competitive game is changing, that it's no longer enough to be the best at investing, but you actually have to have the best interface as well if you want to make sure that you have trust and you maintain trust in the future. And that's quite a profound challenge, because you might rightly be saying, that's not fair, right? What if we're better and somebody else gets the business? Well, the reality is that we live in a world in which the most trusted survive, and that's simply how it is. So to us, the challenge is, do we adapt or do we simply let this happen? And to me, the real thing is that where money flows, ultimately change is formed. How we spend, especially in a sort of corporate and investment context, does materially impact the world we live in. And this is a responsibility that we all carry. So really, as trust is shifting to interfaces, we're seeing this interface revolution. And this interface revolution is powering this, what I call social capital markets. Now, capital markets are already a product of sentiment. Social capital markets are simply recognizing the relationships involved. Now, has anybody here ever done a business deal without building at least a little bit of a relationship? I haven't. I don't think you have either. But the reality is that we are notorious for pretending that relationships don't matter because of compliance and rules, and conflict of interest statements, all that stuff. We pretend like relationships don't matter, and yet they do so much. So it's time to recognize that. And it's time to understand that the way relationships are built today is completely different from how it used to be. So what we're looking at is this global relationship renaissance. And the core ingredients to that are authenticity and purpose. Authenticity meaning, ultimately I do as I say, and purpose meaning I do it for a reason. If you go to a dinner party, I'm sure you do this, and you basically talk to someone and say, so, what do you do, right? And that person tells you, I work in investment, but tell you what, I just do it for the money. Would you want to have a conversation with that person over dinner? Probably not, right? Yet this is exactly what every single organization, or most organizations in the world, do. Yeah, we're in telco, we're in investments, we're in this or in that, but we just do it for the money. Guess what? That's not a great proposition. The much better proposition is to recognize that purpose is a great business model. In fact, this is already supplemented by ample research that, in fact, companies with purpose do perform better. But also, of course, they're much happier companies, right? And they're also much more, focused on well-being, because at least people in a company that has a purpose feel that purpose and can work with that purpose. So, we're talking about a world that is increasingly trust first. We trust until we're proven guilty or otherwise. It's personalized. It's very empowered with technology. And we see this in our day-to-day lives, the apps and technologies we use. And it's driven by simplicity, because nobody likes complexity. So, what's really happening is that data is not such a thing as the new oil, as The Economist has titled, but data is much more like the new nuclear power. And the reason for that is basically that once your data is gone, it's incredibly hard to get it back. So you put yourself and your data at the mercy of companies and technologies and interfaces on a daily basis. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that that actually creates exposure. That's an action that will give us a lot of value, but it's also going to basically expose us to a lot of risk. So data is really the essence of the digital economy. It's the essence of risk management, and it's most certainly also the essence of value. And when you look at Klaus Schwab, the WF chairman, he said, in the new world, it's not the big fish eating the small fish. It's the fast fish that competes against the slow fish. This is the question of digital empowerment, because the small fish, right, never had these tools in the past, never was empowered in the past. Now they are, and as a collective, as a community, the small fish can be quite strong. which is also why, for example, we kind of looked at a couple years back how a swarm of fintechs can actually cover most of the things a financial institution does. So this has created an opportunity, really, for us to rethink how business is done and to focus on a completely new world order in which speed and agility is the core and in which trust is the outcome, much more than it has been. So really, trust is at the core of what is being currently on the agenda. But I'll tell you one thing. It doesn't matter where we go or where we have these conversations. Trust attitudes vary completely between generations. So I, as a Gen Y, will have a completely different trust attitude for the most part than some of the Gen X or baby boomers in the room. And this is, again, completely different when it comes to Gen Z. So you cannot imagine how many daily conflicts and misunderstandings happen because we have different attitudes to trust. The classic one being, the Gen X and baby boomer will expect trust to be earned, right? I'm not going to trust you until you earn my trust. And the Gen Y and Gen Z say, why don't you trust me? Now come into this business, let me show you what I can do. And then the Gen X says, no. That's not going to happen. First, you earn my trust. This causes a lot of frustration. Now, I personally have experienced this too. I worked in the family business, and boy, you have no idea what that's like. You know, kind of when your dad's like, come on, you learn from me first, okay? So our generation is facing this. And this is really fascinating because data and trust attitudes and the way we deal with technology differs by generation. So, baby boomers, it's really about handshakes. This is my dad, pretty much. Technology is kind of this distraction that you do because of your children, and data is sort of this necessary evil, you know, if you have to prove a point, you use some data to prove it. And then we look at the Gen X, right? Gen X loves rules. We love rules. Gen Xers love rules. In fact, they love it so much that, you know, they understand that technology is a tool set, but rules and data, that's my insurance policy. You know, just in case things go wrong, I followed the rules, and here's the statistics. Yeah? And then Gen Y is more like Google first and, well, think second or third, pretty much. Yeah, that's us. And technology is kind of this internal enabler, and data is our currency. We give our data if we give value. You can have anything you want about me. Just give me some value back. Cool. Causes a problem, of course. Gen Z, then, is far worse, even. Basically, digital enables, it's kind of the first reality, yeah? It's the reality people live in most of the time. And technology is really the infrastructure that Gen Z perceives the world through, with data being the context of everyday life. And this is interesting because I have this friend who has a Gen Z daughter, and he says, Philip, I remind my daughter every day that there is a world outside the screen. That world actually exists. And this causes a huge amount of challenge because, of course, every generation will have a different attitude. Now, I will say, before you think that I'm advocating over trust, too much trust is just as bad as too little trust, okay? And we fall prey to both sides of this coin. This is the classic corporate innovation conversation, that skepticism makes us trust far too little, that we keep doing things the way we've always done them, and we forget the fact that there might be better technologies available.
Hello and welcome. I'm Philipp Kristian, and today with me is Lube Elliott. We've known each other for a long time. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Philip. It's a pleasure to be on this show with you.
I'm greatly excited because Lube's a very interesting fellow. I'd love for you to briefly talk about your background and specifically your current field, which is AI art, which brings us to a really interesting trust conversation, at least from where I sit, around when AI can be creative, to what extent it can be creative, and also what it means when the relatively unique franchise that humans have on creativity now gets augmented, enriched, or maybe challenged. So I think there's a lot for us to dive into. Lube, how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, that is a good question, because certainly when I was studying languages at Cambridge, I wouldn't have thought that in my following career, I would spend a lot of time working with artists and technologists and giving talks on AI art, curating exhibitions, chairing panel discussions, and organizing other events. So, yeah, I guess it was a bit of a surprise in some ways. So I began working in this field probably in 2015 or 2016 when there was something called Deep Dream that came out of one of the Google labs. So it's this technology where you have an image and the algorithm kind of looks at it, then it gets like super excited by certain features in the image, and you get various crazy colors and shapes coming out of it.
Cool.
So it was sort of interesting like a few years back.
Yeah.
And I noticed that a lot of technologists were working with it, and I became interested in connecting all these different worlds. So the artists who were maybe curious about the technology, the researchers who were developing the tools, and all the other parts of the ecosystem too. So I began by hosting a meetup in London, and that led to bigger projects such as workshops at big academic AI conferences, and then exhibitions and galleries and media art festivals.
It's cool how community is really the beginning of so many great things. You just gather humans around a fireplace and things happen. So is AI just really a fancy brush? Or a better chisel? What is it? What is it? Is it a tool? Is it the artist? Being provocative here, but
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of your first link to the paintbrush just kind of made me think of some artists who definitely see it as a tool, and in kind of very current discussions around copyright, they sometimes think, well, artists don't always kind of write which brand of paintbrush they use. So,
interesting, very interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and to them, kind of AI is also kind of one of these almost like commonplace systems. But maybe that's kind of jumping too far ahead. To kind of answer your initial really question as to what is AI, to me as a curator in the field, it really kind of depends on how the artist uses it, because artists come from a variety of backgrounds and they choose to engage with these tools in very different ways. So you might have some artists who have a very kind of high technical skill, and they sometimes develop systems like this Deep Dream that I mentioned, which is like an algorithm that looks at an image and then it comes up with something that wasn't there. So to me, in a way, it is the technology being creative. It's sort of imagining all these colors and creatures that were never in an existing image. And I think that's a good example.
I do want to double click on that. So the human consciousness that created the algorithm, is that not ultimately the source of the creativity? An analogous example, right? A car. Humans invented the car, but we rarely talk about how the car is stronger than us as a liability on our human strength. Of course, the car is stronger than us because we engineered the car with more power. But all of that power comes from humans extracting the petrol, which starts as oil and then gets refined, and us building the car and the engine. So actually all that power emanates from the human mind, does it not? Do you relate to that in the sense of AI art, or do you think this technology has become creative in its own right?
So I would agree with you, yes, that art tends to start with the humans. So a lot of the artists who have made the most successful AI artwork these days, so maybe people like Mara Klingemann, Anna Ridler, and others, they spent a lot of time thinking about the concepts behind the artwork and how they will work with these technologies to make something that maybe communicates a feeling or the vision of the world. So there is a lot of human thought and creativity put into it. And then to kind of think about the comment you made about that, isn't it kind of the human mind that kind of created this program that then makes something creative from the images? And that is a very good point. And the project I mentioned, kind of the Google Deep Dream that was created by Alex Mardvinsov, I think when it was being developed, it was kind of being made for a totally different purpose. So the fact that it performed as it did was almost kind of unexpected.
So it's like you have a kid, and then the kid turns out to be a piano virtuoso, and you can't play for, even if your life depended on it. So then it's really just, you wonder, where is it coming from? It's just nature doing its thing, right? And we might just be the vehicles being channeled by nature to create this stuff, which is really interesting, because right now it seems that the world of business, at least, is quite apocalyptic in narrative. And I always find that odd, because so often have we been warned that the world is imminently going to end, and then we're still around to suffer it or enjoy it. So to point this to AI art, it's almost that in the flood of AI conversation, that beautiful human, perhaps slightly philosophical and creative dimension has somewhat gotten lost. It's almost a certain bastardization that's happened with AI art being now basically anyone who puts a prompt in some sort of generative thing. Are they an artist? No, of course not. But that's basically where the conversation's at for the most part. How do you feel about that? And where do you think things are going?
It's interesting that you say that they're not an artist if they put in a prompt and get an image. Because of course, that is what some artists do.
I don't know.
And
I don't know.
Yeah, and even though I think in general I'm kind of less of a fan of this prompt generated art, I do know that there is a community of artists who spent a while developing the right prompt and testing it out and seeing what images they get. And then maybe afterwards they also tweak the images, like in Photoshop, or like make collages, or even kind of make these images somehow into physical objects using the designs as inspiration for sculpture and so on. So
That's cool.
There is also, scope for interesting work made with prompts, though I think in general I do agree with you. The fact that these tools have become kind of so accessible and so easy to use has sort of almost devalued the technology and made it more challenging in some ways for people to be perceived as artists.
That's interesting then, because that does bring us back to the brush. If it's just a fancy brush, if you can use a fancy brush, great, but the brush maketh not an artist, right? I can use very fancy oil paint, but I'm not sure the outcome is necessarily going to be up to scratch. Which brings us to a philosophical discussion as to whether art should be ugly or can be ugly, or, whether ugly art is art. I really don't want to get into that, because there are very, very passionate people on either side of this conversation who I don't want to offend. However, I do think that technology can both enrich our possibilities, possibly, and it can also constrain them. So how do you sense that the development of AI is influencing the art field in general? Is it a positive influence overall, or is it somewhat mixed?
So to me, the art world in general seems to be quite a traditional and slow-moving institutions. So I've been working with and around these AI art tools for 7 or 8 years now. And over that space of time, I've seen more museums put on shows related to AI art, particularly once NFTs came along and, they needed the younger audiences and maybe the money that would come with these things. Yeah. And then, of course, the auction houses have sort of caught up. And there has also been a movement in integrating AI into the broader, I think, museum operations. So anything from analyzing the collections to figuring out how to better engage with visitors. So there has been a lot of kind of positivity, I think. And of course, there is some concern and worry with the ethics and some kind of misuse of these technologies, but it's mainly in other fields. But saying that the artists and kind of museums are often spaces where some of these concerns are being highlighted. So, for example, there are a lot of artists who work with facial recognition technologies to kind of highlight the concerns about their applications and for surveillance and so on. And yeah, there are also lots of events that museums hold that maybe look at bias in the data sets and so on. So I think museums and art industry is almost like a good space to engage people with technology and its pros and cons in general.
That's almost, it triggers this idea of art as a commentary on society, which I think is, does art imitate life or life imitate art is the cheesy version that we hear over a beer, I think. But the point is quite apt that art can provide playful commentary on society. At the same time, it does raise the question, if the brush is autonomous, right? Is that then the opportunity for anyone to become an artist? And is that a good thing because we become less elitist about it? Or is it a bad thing because there is an inflation of, the classicists have resented the urinal. For those of you who don't know this, maybe that's a story to tap into. The upside down urinal. Was it Duchamp? I think so, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was Duchamp,
who offended the art world that was traditional, emphasizing technique over just idea and concept. Do you think that debate's just coming up again, or how do you relate to this? Or do you think these are just unrelated things and it's just Philipp kind of going off on a tangent?
Well, no, the urinal has been brought up in these discussions. So it's kind of
Nobody's ever said that before. Nobody's ever said that before out of context.
Yeah.
The urinal has been brought up in these discussions. Anyway, sorry.
The most
that is a
sharp urinal.
Yes, fabulous.
I should, contextualize it like that. Yeah.
You never know who's going to quote you out of context there.
Well, I trust you, Philipp.
And you can. Good. Anyway, back to my question, hopefully, if I may.
Yes. Back to your question, thinking about kind of the technique. So I would say there are a variety of artistic practices these days, and some of them do emphasize the technique, like particularly maybe kind of the early artists who worked with some of the older tools like GANs, where once you kind of generated the images, it was more obvious that they were kind of done by the computer because the figures had kind of the arms or the facial features in the wrong place, and so on. And I think nowadays, maybe with the latest kind of prompt-based image generation tools, the images are very good. So in some ways, you need less actual technique to make art that looks like art to the average person. But on the other hand, you do need more skill if you want something that art lovers would consider seriously.
Yeah, and this brings the whole issue with valuation as well, right? The corpses that have made it their way into museums as provocative art comes to mind. Joseph Beuys, controversial. There really is no one answer, which is true for all of the world now. It almost seems that the world is imitating art because all of a sudden in the business world, there's also really no more answers. There is just guesses. So that's perhaps something interesting. Because it does change the playing field. It does make us also wonder why we're so concerned about plagiarism or this idea that something is becoming easier, because perhaps the opportunity is to collaborate with technology. Why not, right? I mean, we collaborate with our cars as well. We don't resist the fact that the car is faster than us. We just get in it. How do you feel about that? What do you think of this?
How do I feel about that? I think it's great to have an option to collaborate with technology, but then not everybody wants to do that. And for some people, even though it is quite easy to do these days, so, like write a prompt and get an image, or like get some text, still, for some people, it's a barrier to kind of begin working with the technology that it might take them a while to overcome.
Fair enough.
So yeah, I think it's great to have this option, but still, it's important for maybe some careers like illustrators or those who have been making art with these, let's say, very traditional methods. It's important for them to, I think, still have some sort of a practice, and you can probably combine these very new and very traditional tools. But yeah, I think the ideas of plagiarism and copyright is something that is kind of always very hotly debated in this field.
Yeah, I imagine that. I'm wondering whether that debate's where it's going, whether that debate is healthy. But an example I like to use on stage is the idea of Google Maps. Most of us 15 years ago were able to navigate to our house and to friends and throughout the cities without a satellite navigation. Nowadays, very few of us can do that because we've gotten used to the facility of the technology enabling this. So there is a sort of fine line, right? What if the great skill that artisans and artists, especially artists of the past, the great attention to detail, right, and the actual skill is being increasingly lost? Stucco, it's very hard to get someone doing stucco nowadays, right? Back in the day, it was the most elaborate, or wood carving, like it's very hard to find these craftsmen. Now, I imagine in the art world, there are a few traditionalists who still upkeep the techniques, but if the path of least resistance is to just use technology to do it, will that human skill survive? What do you think?
I do think these skills will survive, at least sort of in the short and medium term, and I can never predict what will happen in 100 or 200 years.